All right, Thursday night. Are we doing okay? Sounds about like a Thursday night. Yeah, all right. I'll take it. Well, hey, I want to honestly start off by thanking you guys, all of you. First, we'll start off with the people in the room. It's a Thursday night and you're here at church, right? You had to find your jeans, remember those things? And you made your way out here. And honestly, I don't know about you, but there is just something different about corporate worship. And you guys are making this, so thank you. But also those of you online joining us, like, you know this more than anyone, that it's not about a building, it's about a people. And the fact that our church has grown small groups and how generous you guys have been. We've seen almost one baptism every weekend so far. And that couldn't happen without you guys sacrificially giving online. So thank you, 242, for real, from the bottom of my heart. I'm so grateful for you, all right? If you don't know me, my name is Joel. I'm one of the teaching pastors here. And everything I just mentioned that you guys are doing so excellently has to do with this series. This series is called Some Good News. Some good news. So let me start off with this. Who is tired of bad news? Actually, let me rephrase that. Who's tired of the news? Yeah, can I get an amen somewhere in this house? And so we said, what if we kind of filtered out all the bad news and we shifted our focus to good news that we do have? Now, here's the tension in this. Good news is subjective. And what I mean by this is good news for some of you might not be that great a news for others of you. In fact, good news for a promotion for someone might mean a demotion for somebody else. Or how about this one? Maybe you have kids during quarantine and one of your kids ran into the house and they're like, good news, good news, good news. I can do 17 spins in a row. And you're like, well, it's good news for you, but it honestly didn't change, my day. Come back when you can mow the lawn. That'll be good news, right? Like, it's subjective, and what we're talking about in this series is this good news we have to offer. The good news we're talking about, it's not just for some people. In fact, we are saying this is good news for all people forever. This news is so good, it's for all people forever. We also talked a few weeks ago how this news is also not contingent. And here's what I mean by this. How many of you have friends that are just like raging optimists? Anybody? Yeah, and so contingent news has to come with bad news. And so when you see something happen that's bad, maybe like a car gets hit and back tires fly off, and the optimist is like, well, good news is you got your front tires. And good news is you got your front teeth. Like, it's just not that good of news because it has to do with bad news. It's contingent. Like, the news we're talking about today, also, we're saying this is not contingent good news. This is for all people forever. And this is the good news we're talking about. Now, that doesn't mean that it doesn't come with bad news. In fact, finish this statement for me. Someone runs into your house and they say, I've got some good news and some bad news. Right? And so the unfortunate side is those news channels that are playing and the bad news we're hearing, it's still real. In fact, it's still accurate. It's still painful. It's still disappointing. However, it makes the good news that much better. And so let's start off today with the bad news, all right? You want to hear the bad news first? Right? Any logical person, if you ask that question, you would say bad news first, right? Right, okay, some of you. The bad news is we are in a global pandemic. I know. Yeah, I'm sorry if you just found out right now. It is. We are making history. This is a time where we really will, I truly believe our kids will read about this. For some of you, your grandkids will read about this in history books. And it is a hard time. In fact, maybe some of you are going, that is the understatement of the century, Joel. It's a very difficult time. And let me tell you specifically who this is difficult for. You ready? Extroverts. See, I am an extrovert, extreme extrovert. And I know you're shocked by it right here. I know this seems insane, but this has legitimately been incredibly difficult for me. And so I know I got some other extroverts in the house. The first few weeks of this, I would just like lay on the floor and make goat noises. Like, it just is hard. In fact, so hard that this started to, honestly, I started to have thoughts and mental health, like this was just getting at me. And so I decided, you know what, this isn't gonna be a season I'm gonna get through. This is a season I'm going to maximize. And so I did. During this time, I've started seeing a counselor. I know, pastor, seeing a counselor. You're allowed to have Jesus and a counselor, all right? Write that down right there. And so I did, and I started seeing this counselor, and she's so mean, y'all. Like my wife has seen a counselor before and she's so loving and caring. Mine is so mean. She's like, suck it up and do what's right. I'm like, okay. But it's so good for me during this time. And I started asking questions to my therapist. I started saying, what is so difficult? In one word, here's what she told me. One word, you ready for this? Loneliness. Loneliness. And I cannot be alone in this, but it's something I wasn't used to. And it's something that was incredibly hard for me. And the more I talked back and forth with my therapist, I began to find out that loneliness is not just mental. It also is incredibly physical, and some would even say spiritual. I mean, remember when God created the earth, he started saying, this is good. He would create something and he'd say, and it's very good. And then he created man and said, well, it's not good specifically for man to be alone. And so this can impact our health. Actually, there's a quote by Mother Teresa that says, the most debilitating disease on the planet Earth is not leprosy or cancer. I would add coronavirus, it's loneliness. And my counselor started explaining to me that this actually can cause a toll on your physical health. In fact, loneliness, she said, can be twice as bad for you as smoking. You guys could have just been smoking this whole time, all right? It's worse for you than diabetes. It can cause joint issues, weight loss, weight gain, even increase heart disease. Something as simple as loneliness. And ironically today, what we are talking about is good news in the midst of loneliness. Because here's the truth. This global pandemic, it doesn't cooperate. And it's still going on. And so I'm not telling you there's not bad news. I'm just telling you we truly have good news in the middle of it. And it's what we'll be talking about today. So if you have your Bibles, you're welcome to turn to 1 Thessalonians, which is a book all about good news. Now I've got to kind of catch you up because today we're talking about good news in loneliness, really good news in relationships, but there's so much more going on if you haven't been here the last 2 weeks. In fact, Acts chapter 17 is where we get the majority of the story of the church of Thessalonica. Everybody say Thessalonica for me. Yes, some pronounce it Thessalonica, but it's a tongue twister and it was the city. And Paul, the author, he's on his missionary journey to this city. And he gets to this city and he starts sharing what is good news. Well, many people in this city, they start accepting this good news and they form a small church called the Church of Thessalonica. And they start spreading this good news here and there. And all of a sudden we meet a guy that's a part of this church named Jason. Now, it always fascinates me when people in biblical days have normal names, right? It's like Bartholomew, Zephyr, and Jason. And so we meet Jason, and Jason's a part of this church, and he has Paul and Silas staying at his house. The problem is the city officials of Thessalonica, they don't like this. See, it's a port city, they're think New York City almost, business is coming, and this church is really ruining business. They're not buying idols. You don't have to pay for forgiveness. The church that this thinks is good news is so good, the city officials think the opposite. And so they drag Jason out of his house into the street. I want you to picture this. Someone comes into your house, drags you out of your house into the street. And all of a sudden they start harassing Jason and they say, where are Paul and Silas? Well, they're not there, and they tell him, well, if we come back and Paul and Silas are here, Jason, you're not only getting arrested, but so is your family. So in the middle of the night, Jason and a few other members of this church, they sneak Paul out of the city. The problem is his visit, it's cut short. His good news he has to share, he can't get it all out. And so he writes a letter known as the letter of 1 Thessalonians that's filled to the brim with good news for this church. And a few weeks ago, we read chapter 1 and we heard that there is good news in suffering that Paul had to write. Last week, we heard that there's good news in disappointment. And today we're gonna learn that there is good news in relationships that may just even be good news in the middle of isolation and loneliness. Let's pick up today where we left off last week. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 12. It says this right here, chapter 2, verse 17 is what we'll pick up. Paul's writing, he says, but brothers and sisters, when we were orphaned by being separated from you for a short time in person, not in thought, Out of our intense longing, we made every effort to see you. Now, what's happening here is Paul got snuck away in the middle of the night, and so rumors started to spread for this church. Some people were like, oh, he doesn't even care about you. He just left. City officials are like, are you kidding me? He didn't even stay through all this. So Paul writes back and he's reminding them, no, I am connected to you. I'm committed to you. We are in a relationship together. And then in chapter 3, he begins to give good news. In fact, chapter 3, verse 6, check this out. He actually even uses this phrase. Watch this. He says, but Timothy, the other guy that was with Paul, one of the other authors, he's just visited them. He said, has just now come to us from you and has brought good news. Now, what's this huge good news that Timothy has to bring about their relationships? He gives two simple words. The good news is about your faith and love. Faith and love. Now, if you are a note taker and you have your Bibles open, underline that, highlight that, circle that, tear that out, swallow that, whatever. Those two words right there are kind of your thesis of chapter 3. Faith and love in the middle of relationships. And so what Paul does for the rest of the chapter is he goes on to explain in the next few verses faith, and then he goes on to explain love. For today specifically, I want to look at the second one first, love, all right? So we fast forward a few verses where Paul gets into this specific concept, verse 12, and this is what he says. May the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other and for everyone else, just as ours does for you. And Paul introduces one of the pieces of good news in the midst of loneliness and relationships, and it's simplified as overflowing love. Now, that may not mean the same thing to you in southeastern or mid-Michigan that it did to them in the 21st or in the first century in the church of Thessalonica. You see, this language was written in the language of Greek. And in the language of Greek, there are multiple words for love. And in the English word, you know how many words we have for love? One. I absolutely hate the English word love. Let me explain. Let me give my point out here. In the single week, I use the word love all the time. How many times do you think you use the word love in a week? I don't know, so I was asking you. But if you know, put it in the chat, all right? I use it a lot. Here's two things I probably say every week. You ready? I love my family. I would take a bullet for any one of my family members. I love my family. And I love pizza. Those are two things I absolutely say every week. The exact same word that mean drastically different things. And when Paul uses the word love here, it's such a specific type of love that we're gonna get to. But what you have to understand is there are other kinds of love. And so when we as a church are called in relationships to love, it doesn't mean like my love for pizza. It means a completely different type of love. And so let's do this. Before we get into Paul's overflowing love, let's look at some of the other biblical terms for love. See, in another letter, Paul writes to that same guy, Timothy. He uses one of these other terms for love, and this is what he says right here in 2 Timothy chapter 3. He said, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, and without love. This right here, this without love word right here is a Greek word astoragos. I think I'm saying that right. I took a semester. Astoragos. And it means anti-love. What way I'm saying it today is it means no love. No love. Now, here's the deal with this word right here. This word no love. This is a specific word reserved for non-Christians. Because in theory, Christians, followers of Christ who have accepted the love of Jesus shouldn't be able to portray no love. However, when we look around, that's not always the case, is it? Now here's also the problem with no love. Nobody admits this about themselves. Right? You don't get set up on a first date and you go see them and they are beautiful head to toe because ain't nothing worse than ugly feet. And you sit down and the waiter brings the free bread. We love the free bread, right? And they bring the free bread and you say, tell me something unique about yourself. And they're like, well, I'm incredibly self-centered and selfish. I have no love and I will use and abuse you. And then when this is all done, I'll kick you to the curb, right? Bring some more ranch. Nobody says that. Like, nobody knows or says about themselves they have no love, but it's pretty easy to spot, isn't it? And the problem with this pandemic that I told you is the bad news going on right now is a lot of people have been experiencing no love. The way you've probably heard it said is they've experienced hurt, and hurt people do what? They hurt people. I would argue the same is opposite. People who are truly loved, love people, they love people. And so as Christians in times where maybe we're not feeling certain love, maybe we're feeling no love, what's coming out of us is no love. And it's incredibly unfortunate to see. Well, it's not the only other type of love the Bible talks about. There's another type of love that actually Jesus talks about that's a little bit better than no love, not much, but he talks about it as well as he talks about kind of the end days, which by the way, next week, if you want to come back, we are talking about the end times in chapter 4 of 1 Thessalonians, and I think you're going to enjoy it. But Jesus is talking about it here, and look at what he says. He says, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Will grow cold. The type of love he's talking about is cold love. The Greek word for this, no joke, is called psycho. Psycho, cold love. I like to call it frostbite of the soul. It's cold love. Now, let me tell you where I think we most experience cold love. You ready? It's gonna actually sting a little bit. Social media. Social media. You see, in 2008, about 10% of Americans had a social media. 12 years later, 2020, what do you think that percentage is up to? 88%. 88% of Americans have social media. Now, I have social media. There's nothing wrong with social media. In fact, it can be used for good, but there is everything wrong with the misuse or overuse of social media. And let me portray this to relationships and isolation and loneliness. Here's what social media does. It gives us connections without the demands of a relationship. And it gives us every opportunity to express what is cold love. I've seen so many of my friends on social media pour their heart out over social media, right? They absolutely pour everything going on in their life outside. And I've seen people, I really have had to call the police because I've seen Facebook friends give their last notice of their life, suicidal notes. I've seen people talk about desperate need where they didn't know what to do or where to go, and I've got to see people come to Christ over social media. I've seen people talk about their spouse in the hospital or troubles with kids. People will pour their hearts out over social media. And what do we do as Christians? Praying, right? A little heart emoji. You guys seen the caring emojis? A little yellow guy who's holding the heart. It's a care emoji. And then we go on with our day like nothing ever happened. And if I can be 100% honest, we don't even pray for them. We say we will. We have good intentions. You see, what this is doing for us is this is cold love, and it's letting us feel connected. I got 5,000 Facebook friends without any demands of the relationship. And you guys know you can be surrounded by people and still be incredibly lonely, right? In fact, I would argue that coronavirus didn't create isolation and loneliness in relationships. It just amplified what was already there. And so we're feeling connected, but without the demands of relationships. And we're not showing the type of love Paul is talking about in 1 Thessalonians. We are showing cold love. Yet we're walking away, patting ourselves on the back because of the amount of comments we sent that we're praying for people. The type of love Paul's talking about in 1 Thessalonians, I'm gonna read it again, is a completely different type of love. And this is a love that is such good news, especially for our relationships. The type of love Paul's talking about, this third type of love, is called overflowing love. I'm gonna reread this verse right here that we see in 1 Thessalonians, where Paul says, "May the Lord make your love increase and overflow for each other, and for everyone else, just as ours does for you," overflowing love. Now the Greek word for this is possibly one you've heard. It's called agape love. If you can't remember it, just think Dory finding Nemo. She's like, escape, and just agape, and you'll never forget it, all right? Agape love, this is a specific type of love that you can only get from God. This is godly love in your life. And the imagery Paul gives here is that you are getting so much godly love that your love for people is overflowing. Now, let me use some imagery here to show you how we currently or commonly misinterpret this. All right, you guys got one of these? You're gonna need one. It's been hot out, all right? So if you got some plants, you're gonna need one of these. I'll give you mine if you want, all right? Now, most of us imagine this filled with water. Now, they told me there's expensive guitars and I can't fill it with water, but that's all right. If I were to take this, it was filled to the brim, and we're using the analogy of love, and I would start pouring this out. I was gonna love my neighbor like I'm told to, and I'm gonna love them here. And eventually what would happen to this? It would become empty. Thursday night, I'm proud of you. I don't think Sunday will get it, we'll see. It will be empty, it's just common sense. So the imagery here of overflowing love, I love this. That you are so filled up, that this thing is about to burst. Water's squirting out of this and squirting out the end so that you're overflowing, and all of a sudden that's getting onto other people, and all of a sudden you're continually filled. And here is what's so cool about this imagery. There is a return on investment here. You see, I mentioned I love pizza. We love lots of things that we pour our love into, right? Houses, cars, jobs, careers, and all it does is leave us empty. But this godly overflowing love, as we start to pour it into other people, they start to get filled up and it begins to pour into other people. And this is a great image of the church. In fact, I have a video here. I wanted to do this live, but we'll take the video. If I were to put 4 of these next to each other right here, the video can start. If I were to put 4 of these next to each other right here, and one was overflowing with water like we see in this first one, eventually what would happen? It would start pouring into the other one. And what's so cool about this is if it's really overflowing, then the second one, it will begin to overflow and it will start pouring into the third one. And the way love works, if they're so filled up, it's overflowing into the third one, it will eventually pour back in to that first one. And it's this constant cycle, this image of the way the church was designed to be. As God created his people and said, listen, I have loved you so much that I've sent my son. Now you need to go out and love people like that. And if we could understand this, listen to me, this could change everything. Because here's what I would argue today. People would say that the opposite of loneliness is relationships, but I mentioned earlier, too many of us have been surrounded by people yet all too lonely. I would argue the opposite of loneliness is loving relationships. Because if you're in a loving relationship and being loved from someone, if you're part of the design of God's church, it is impossible to be alone. In fact, the opposite, where you can be filled with people yet filled with loneliness, you could be in isolation yet filled with overflowing love. Chapter 17 is all about the church of 1 Thessalonians. The chapter right before it, Paul's visit, right before this, we catch him in prison, yet he's singing hymns. Why? He gets something. Overflowing love, the same news he writes in the next chapter to the letter of 1 Thessalonians. Now here's the deal with overflowing love. It takes something of us. It's sacrificial. You see, catch this, you can give without loving. You can give without godly love. We see this all the time. Wonderful givers that aren't Christians at all, but you can give without loving or give with a tight grasp, but you cannot love without giving. And this is the type of overflowing love Paul writes to the church of 1 Thessalonians and says, listen, I've got some good news for you. I've got some incredible news for you. If you get this right, this will transform your church and your city. And I would say the same thing for today. Now, here's where it gets cool. I had mentioned earlier that Paul said the good news was 2 things. It wasn't just love. Actually, the first thing he mentioned was faith. And the reason Paul started with this is so important because you can't experience godly love if you haven't experienced God. You can't experience godly love if you haven't experienced God. And so if you're sitting here saying, why don't I have this? Well, why isn't this overflowing in my life? I wonder if you've truly sat and experienced who God is. In fact, you can't experience the good news in relationships if you haven't experienced the good news of Jesus. And let me tell you, church, this is the good news that this entire series is about. That there is a God out there who loves you so much. He doesn't just ordinary love you, he agape loves you. Right? John 3:16 says, for God, he so loved you. In fact, how much did he love you? He realized he couldn't be with you unless he came to you. And so in flesh, Jesus came to this earth, and I'm telling you, if Jesus would have came as a king over kings, he would have been humbling himself because he is God, but he came as a servant. For one reason, so that he could sympathize with you, so that he could feel loneliness and pain and suffering and disappointment. And yet, through all of this, as not only fully man, but fully God, he walked 33 years on this earth, only to ultimately give his life on the cross. In fact, this good news, the biblical term for it is gospel. And some of you might be saying, that does not sound like good news. Death is not usually good news, but it's what happened through that death. You see, I told you his life was perfect. You and I know our life is not. And so on that cross, our past became his past. God couldn't even look at him because our sin and our shame and our guilt was on his shoulders, and his past became our past. So when God looks at us, he doesn't see us. He doesn't see our past. He sees his son, Jesus. And I'm telling you, church, it's good news. It's good news. And this good news right here could change everything. It doesn't change the bad news. It doesn't make the coronavirus go away. But we realize that this is so much bigger than this. This is so much bigger than a year or two in history. This is something that impacts eternity. And I'm telling you, it is good news. In fact, one of my favorite verses kind of summarizing this good news is found in the book of Romans. It's written by the same guy who wrote the book of 1 Thessalonians, also on his missionary journey. He writes to the church of Rome. And he says this, therefore, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. In other words, the reason we aren't condemned is because Christ condemned himself. And I've heard this verse a million times, all right? I grew up memorizing this verse, but there was one part of this verse I always missed, and it was that word, now. You're looking for some good news? That means this is not futuristic eternal love. I'm sick and tired of Christians thinking that what Christianity can do for me, what the gospel can do for me is it can get me a ticket into heaven. No. There is now no condemnation in Christ Jesus. That means what you did last week, last night, that thing you did when you were a teenager or a young adult that you just can't get over, that died with the cross of Jesus. And there is now no condemnation. And I'm telling you, church, this is good news. What I'm also telling you is if you've experienced that type of agape, godly, overflowing love, then it's time we turn around and be the church and be the water spigot and begin to show that love around us. And this will be good news for your relationships. And guess what? We can do this in the middle of all of this. We can do this from a distance. We can do this while being safe. We can show overflowing love. In fact, as I close today, I want to actually show you a video that is our church, this church, that is actually showing love publicly to the world around them. It's actually our church and the people in here that are able to do this at a distance and in a wonderful way, because here's the deal about overflowing love. You ready for this? It transcends all things. Overflowing love, it transcends hard times. It transcends our past. It transcends financial difficulties. In fact, it even transcends a global pandemic. And once we've experienced this type of overflowing love, there's no excuse to have no love or cold love except to have and share overflowing love with the world around us.